Hi, I'm back to finish off probably the third out of four video posts on the third weekend of Mythic Warrior. Um, as I mentioned, the third weekend in Mythic Warrior, we call it Dad Weekend, but the whole weekend is about men exploring how the past, particularly their relationship to their fathers, in positive or negative ways, have affected their sense of their own masculinity. And uh, and so, in the last post, I talked about you know starting out in the morning with the dance of life, and then the willow in the wind, and then coming in, and then after having brunch, breakfast, coming in to do the morning's work, which involved some shamanic journeying, sharing the dream of a man on the cross with their father, and then a ritual going outside and digging a hole and vomiting the poisons, the toxins that may have resulted from men's relationships with their fathers. And after that, we have a midday break, and then we come back into our workroom and to have a death lodge with our fathers. So let me explain the death lodge in a more general context. Um, I've taught how to do a death lodge in Vision Quest for 35 years, and it's a very powerful and wonderful ritual. And so I'm going to just start speaking about the death lodge in a general term, and then talk about how we do it in a circle of men. So, for example, if I were leading a vision quest, I often teach a bunch of tools and rituals and exercises that people can do on their vision quest, and doing a death lodge is one. So, the ritual of the death lodge came into the United States out of Central America and gradually made its way up into the southern central plains of what's now the USA. And in that tradition, people who lived long ago and who lived in villages and lived close to nature would very often know when their time was coming. They'd be aware as they started to enter that dying process. And when that would happen, the person in that dying process would go sit in an area, it might have been a lodge or a teepee or whatever, in the village that was known as the Death Lodge. And quickly word would travel around that this person was in the Death Lodge, and so the people would realize that if they wanted to pay their last respects, have their last conversation with the person about to depart, that there really wasn't much time to do it. And so over the next few days, let's say, as the person sat in the Death Lodge, people one by one would come into the lodge and sit down to have that last conversation. And these conversations were, I expect, mostly bittersweet. The sweet part of it would be if the person was soon to leave, the rest of the people in the village would not want that person to leave without thanking them, honoring them, thanking them for how they'd contributed, perhaps directly to a person's life, or how they contributed indirectly, and that by supporting this or that activity of the village, they helped to create a space which fed the hearts and souls of whoever lived in the village. So these conversations were often bittersweet, the sweetness of the thanks and the gratitude and the honoring, and the bitterness of the goodbye, and that this would be the last chance to express anything. And so often those, as I say, conversations were bittersweet, but occasionally they were a little different because it was also the last chance to work out any stuff, any issues, concerns, resentments that might have been carried and not dealt with. And so in that instance, anger might need to be expressed, but it was anger with the intention to make it good, to express the hurt or the disappointment or the whatever, so that one could get to that frustrated longing and desire for connection and relationship that just perhaps never happened, and to speak about why. And so, you know, after I, and then after the requisite time was up, the person would then leave the death lodge, and he or she would be free to take their, quote, last walk into the mountains. So I teach that ritual on virtually as one of the tools I give people on their vision quests. And very often, then when people are on their solos and they're out in nature on their alone time, they will find or create a place to do a death lodge. And on a vision quest, doing a death lodge, you would find or create a clearing or create a circle, and you would go and enter into that circle. Maybe you'd start by with a ritual, smudging, prayer, and then you would essentially go into the center of it and sit down or stand and say, "My death lodge is open now. Anyone who wishes to come, I welcome you." And then, depending on, and there are different ways to do it, a person on a vision quest might know, that there were these several people that they really wanted to talk to, and so they might call them in one by one, perhaps a spouse or parents or children, and have those conversations. Or the person could just sit and try and be present, and whatever people might enter their mind, then they would say, "Oh, this person has entered my death lodge." And at that point, they would imagine that person sitting in front of them and proceed to speak everything they would need to say, taking the point of view, I will never, ever in my life get to speak with this person again. And very often, death lodges are very emotional as children, as parents, as people you love dearly come into the lodge, and you realize this is your last chance you will ever get to say what you need to say to them. So it can be very emotional. Or it can be emotional in other ways, and as people who have hurt you deeply or betrayed you or disappointed you in major ways appear. It's kind of a last chance to complete business. So in Mythic Warrior, in the afternoon, we all come together as a large group, and I announce that this afternoon we're all going to have a death lodge with our fathers. And so anyway, I explain the whole process, how it'll go, and then we count off enough to make small group, because a death lodge with 15, 20 people it's just too big. So in our group, we counted off, and we had groups of 7 people. So I was in a small group of 7 people, and the group separated. So my group went over into another building. It was kind of like a upstairs meeting gathering room, very comfortable, and we moved some furniture around, so we had a nice space of 7 people, a circle that felt together and we could be intimate. And in the center of that circle, we took 2 pillows, put 2 pillows there. And one by one, each man went into the center of the circle, and he sat on a pillow, and he called his father in to sit on the pillow in front of him. So he may have had his father his father sitting in spirit, imagining his father there, or sometimes the men asked other men to sit in place of their fathers so they could speak directly to them. So one by one, the men got up, entered this circle, called or asked another man to sit in place of their father, and had their last conversation. taking the point of view that each of us would never, ever again get to speak or have a chance to say what we needed to say to our fathers. And this was it. We had to. We better do it now. And as I said, this not only can be, but this was a very emotional time. We had men come into the circle who had really close and wonderful relationships with their father, and maybe a father who had died recently. And so, in that speaking from the heart, there were times with tremendous grief and sadness would pour out as they spoke to their father. For other men, tremendous anger would come out. We had men whose fathers had left the family at a very early age, and they felt abandoned and neglected by their fathers. There was a man whose father killed himself when he was 6 years old, and both incredible rage and grief that his father could do that to him, and the struggle of his life to have any sense of a protective fathering presence, the struggle in his life to trust men, the struggle in his life to just not give all of his emotional needs and desires to women. So I personally, my father died in 2004, and mine was about the grief around my refusal to have a close relationship with my father. You know, I had a childhood that involved some physical abuse and some really nasty things he said to me. You know, when he once told me I'd caused his heart attacks because I was such a rotten son. And, you know, I was a straight A student. And so based on that, I came into adulthood and just like always kept my father at a distance, you know, for probably from the time that I was 20 until my early 50s. I was not going to let him in until he apologized. And of course, he never did. I mean that he wasn't in the kind of generation who apologized to their children. But through the years, I realized that refusal to let my father in, who, you know, decades past that, was trying his best and expressing his love in the ways that he was capable to me, and I would have none of it. And I finally had done enough work at some point where I realized that I'd had enough. I'd had enough with Sparrow. I'd had enough of refusing and holding on to my resentment. And yes, those wounds hurt, but at that point, you know, 30 years later, holding that resentment was just hurting myself. And I eventually got to the place where I kind of like dropped it and opened my heart to my father again, which was really wonderful. But he died a year later. And so, you know, today or this past weekend when my father came into the lodge was just tons of grief for those decades where I had denied and refused of missing the kind of loving and possibility of a relationship, which was there if I'd have been able to open to it. And I had a lot of grief about missing that time. But anyway, there were 7 of us, and one by one, we all went in. We all expressed what we needed to. And when it was done, we all stood up, closed the death lodge, came into the center, hugged each other, looked in each other's eyes, and shared what we felt and how connected we felt to each other at that point. And we also shared a little bit of, well, let me just say this something, something that I have heard from many women, for decades, some kind of judgment like, oh, men aren't really in touch with their feelings. And certainly as I stood there and looked into the eyes of men, I thought, you do not know what you're talking about. Anyway, so it was a really rich afternoon, our death lodge with our fathers, and a really strong experience of men deeply, deeply sharing their feelings in the presence of other men, men they're connected to, men they feel safe with. And it takes a lot, in this world in 2023 for men to find a place where they feel safe enough to really share who they are without being judged. And in Mythic Warrior, we create those spaces, and we create a lot of them. And it's a blessing to experience. So that's my post for today, and I wish everyone the best. And I think I have one more post on Mythic Warrior Weekend 3. Aho.